In the spring of 1974, two farmers stood at a fence line in Cass County, Nebraska, looking out over identical sections of land, both 320 acres of rolling prairie that their grandfathers had homesteaded in the 1880s. Their farms sat side by side, separated only by a gravel county road, and that fence line where they often met to talk about weather, crops, and the challenges of making a living from the soil. One of those men was named Dale Kruger, 42 years old, cautious by nature, farming with a 1958 John Deere 720 and a collection of implements that had seen better days but still functioned. The other was Carl Hoffman, 39, ambitious, confident, and on that particular May morning, absolutely convinced he'd figured out the secret to modern farming success. Carl had just taken delivery of a brand new John Deere 4430, and he was practically glowing with excitement as he told Dale about it. "You need to do this," Carl said, gesturing toward the gleaming green tractor parked in his yard. "That old 720 of yours is ancient history. Get yourself a 4430, finance it over 7 years, and watch what happens. I'm telling you, Dale, this is the future. You're leaving money on the table running antique equipment." Dale, polite as always, nodded and said he'd think about it. But in his gut, something felt wrong about borrowing $48,000 for a tractor. 5 years later, Carl Hoffman's farm was being auctioned off by the bank, and Dale Kruger was still farming that same 320 acres with the same old 720, completely debt-free, watching his neighbor's life disintegrate. What happened between those two moments is a story about the deadliest lie in American agriculture, and why the farmer who resists peer pressure might be the only one who survives. Before I explain exactly how Carl Hoffman lost everything while his neighbor thrived, you need to understand the economic trap that was being set for American farmers in the mid-1970s, because this wasn't just about one man's bad decision. This was a systemic problem that would eventually destroy hundreds of thousands of family farms across the Midwest. Between 1973 and 1974, American agriculture experienced what looked like a golden age. Corn prices spiked over $3 per bushel, driven by massive Soviet grain purchases, global crop failures, and currency devaluation. Wheat hit $5. Soybeans topped $12. Farmers who'd struggled for years were suddenly making money hand over fist. A farmer with 320 acres of corn, averaging 120 bushels per acre, at $3 per bushel, was looking at gross revenue of over $115,000. After costs, that might net $40,000 to $50,000 in a single year, more than many farmers had made in the previous 5 years combined. The financial industry's response was predictable and catastrophic. Banks and farm credit lenders saw farmers making record profits and sitting on land that was appreciating at 15% to 20% annually. Land that had sold for $600 per acre in 1970 was going for over $1,200 by 1974, and appraisers were projecting it would hit $2,000 within a few years. To the lending industry, this looked like a risk-free opportunity. Farmers had valuable collateral that was increasing in value. They had strong cash flow from high commodity prices, and they needed equipment to expand and capture more of those inflated revenues. The equation seemed simple. Lend farmers money secured by appreciating land, collect interest, and watch everyone get rich together. Equipment manufacturers were equally aggressive. John Deere, International Harvester, Alice Chalmers, and others were producing tractors that represented genuine technological leaps forward. The John Deere 4430, introduced in 1972, was a transformational machine, 125 horsepower, turbocharged diesel engine, power shift transmission, enclosed cab with air conditioning and heat, hydraulics that could handle implements the previous generation couldn't dream of pulling. This was an incremental improvement. This was a tractor that could let one man farm twice the acres in half the time. The 4430 cost about $48,000 new in 1974, which was more than most farmers' annual net income. But dealers had financing programs that made it seem almost painless. 7-year loans at 8 to 9% interest meant monthly payments of around $750. "You'll cover that in increased productivity," the salesman said. "You'll pay it off early with the extra revenue from farming more acres more efficiently." What nobody was emphasizing, what the dealers glossed over and the bankers soft-pedaled, and the agricultural economists at the land-grant universities barely mentioned, was that this entire financial structure was built on assumptions that had never been tested over a full economic cycle. The assumption that commodity prices would stay high. The assumption that land values would continue appreciating. The assumption that interest rates will remain stable. The assumption that weather would cooperate and yields would be consistent. And most dangerously, the assumption that nothing could go seriously wrong. These assumptions weren't based on historical precedent. They were based on 2 or 3 years of unusual conditions being extrapolated into permanent trends. And when you build a financial plan on temporary conditions and pretend they're permanent, you're not farming, you're gambling. Dale Kruger understood this instinctively, even if he couldn't articulate the economic theory behind it. He'd grown up during the Depression, watched his father nearly lose a farm in the 1950s during a period of low prices and tight credit, and he had a bone-deep suspicion of debt. His father had told him something when he was 16 years old, working the fields during harvest. The minute you owe money on equipment, you're not working for yourself anymore. You're working for the bank. And the bank doesn't care if you have a drought or a flood or if prices collapse. The payment is due either way. Dale had never forgotten that. So when Carl Hoffman stood at the fence line in May of 1974, practically evangelizing about the new 4430, Dale listened politely and then went home and did nothing. Carl Hoffman, on the other hand, was a true believer. He wasn't reckless or stupid. Far from it. He'd done the math. He'd talked to his accountant, his banker, and the extension agent from the University of Nebraska. Everyone agreed upgrading equipment was the smart move. Carl's 320 acres, farmed efficiently with modern equipment, could potentially generate enough revenue to support expansion. If he could rent or buy another 160 acres, he'd be farming 480 total, and the economics of scale would really kick in. The 4430 would let him handle that additional acreage without hiring help. He'd gone to the John Deere dealer in town, a smooth-talking guy named Dennis Paulson who'd sold equipment to half the county, and Dennis had shown him the numbers. $48,000 tractor, finance over 7 years at 8.5%, monthly payment of $762, annual payment $9,144. Seemed manageable when Carl was projecting net income of $45,000 based on 1973 crop prices. Dennis had also convinced Carl to buy a new 6-row planter, $12,000, and a new chisel plow, $6,000. Total equipment package, $66,000 financed. Monthly payment jumped to about $1,000. Annual payment, $12,000. Still seemed reasonable when corn was $3 a bushel. Carl signed the papers in March of 1974, took delivery in April, and by May he was farming with equipment that made him feel like he'd entered a new era. The 4430 was powerful, smooth, comfortable. He could work 12-hour days without the physical exhaustion he'd felt running the old Farm-LM he'd been using. He planted his 320 acres in less than a week, compared to nearly 3 weeks with the old equipment. He felt like a genius. That summer, he stopped at Dale's place one evening and found Dale cultivating corn with the old 720, moving slowly down the rows, no cab, no air conditioning, just a metal seat and an umbrella for shade. Carl pulled up in his pickup, got out, and walked to the field edge. When Dale finished a pass and shut down the tractor, Carl called out, "You're killing yourself running that dinosaur. Come on, Dale, get with the times. Buy a 4430. You won't regret it." Dale climbed down from the 720, his shirt soaked with sweat, and wiped his face with a bandana. "Can't afford it, Carl." Carl laughed. "Sure you can. Finance it. That's what I did. The payment's nothing compared to what you'll make with better equipment." Dale shook his head slowly. "I don't like owing money." Carl's expression shifted to something between pity and condescension. "That's old thinking, Dale. Modern farming requires capital investment. You can't compete if you're not willing to leverage your assets." Dale didn't argue. He just said, "Maybe you're right," and went back to cultivating. The 1974 growing season was excellent across Nebraska. Good rains, moderate temperatures, strong yields. Carl's 320 acres averaged 122 bushels per acre of corn. He sold most of it in November at $2.85 per bushel. Prices had come down from the peak, but were still historically strong. Gross revenue, $111,380. His operating costs had increased substantially. More fuel for the bigger tractor, more fertilizer based on aggressive agronomist recommendations, more chemicals, higher maintenance costs on complex equipment. Total costs, about $60,000. Net before equipment payments, $51,380. After equipment payments of $12,000, $39,380. Spectacular, better than he'd ever done. Carl felt completely vindicated. He bought a new pickup truck, took his wife on a vacation to Colorado, and started talking to his banker about buying that additional 160 acres to expand operation. Dale Kruger's 320 acres yielded 118 bushels per acre, slightly less than Carl's, probably due to less aggressive fertilization and older planting equipment that wasn't quite as precise. Dale sold at $2.70 per bushel, a bit lower because he sold earlier and missed some of the fall price recovery. Gross revenue, $102,432. Dale's costs were dramatically lower. The 720 burned gasoline instead of diesel, which was actually less efficient on a per-gallon basis. But the tractor was lighter and pulled smaller implements, so total fuel consumption was comparable. His fertilizer bill was half of Carl's because he believed in conservative application rates based on soil tests, not agronomist sales pitches. No equipment payments. Total costs, about $38,000. Net, $64,432. Dale made $25,000 more than Carl on the same acreage with lower yields, simply because he had no debt. But here's what's crucial to understand. Both men looked at their 1974 results and felt confirmed in their choices. Carl saw that he'd netted nearly $40,000 even after equipment payments and concluded the investment was paying off. Dale saw that he'd netted over $60,000 and felt a conservative approach was working. Neither of them understood yet that they were looking at an outlier year, not the new normal. And Carl, buoyed by success, made his second critical mistake. In early 1975, he bought 160 acres from a neighbor who was retiring. The land cost him $320,000, $2,000 per acre, which was the peak of the market, though nobody knew it at the time. He put down $64,000, basically all of his 1974 profit, and financed the rest, $256,000 over 20 years at 9% interest. Annual payment, $25,920. Carl now owed $38,000 per year in equipment and land payments. But he wasn't worried. He was farming 480 acres now, 50% more land than before. The math, on paper, still worked. 480 acres at 120 bushels per acre at $2.75 per bushel would gross $158,400. Operating costs might hit $85,000 with the additional acreage. Net before payments, $73,400. After payments, $35,400. Still profitable. Still seemed manageable. Carl was convinced he was building an empire. Dale, watching this from across the fence line, felt a growing sense of unease. He didn't say anything to Carl. It wasn't his place to criticize another man's decisions, but he thought about his father's warning constantly. Carl wasn't farming anymore. He was servicing debt. Every acre he planted, every bushel he harvested, a huge chunk of it was already spoken for before he ever saw a penny. And Dale knew from family history what happened when you structured your operation that way, and the market turned against you. The market turned in 1975. Not catastrophically, but enough to hurt. Corn prices drifted down to $2.35 per bushel as global production recovered and Soviet purchases decreased. For Carl, farming 480 acres, this was painful but survivable. His yields were good, 119 bushels per acre. Gross revenue, $135,432. Operating costs, $87,000. Fuel prices had increased due to the ongoing oil crisis. Net before payments, $48,432. After payments, $10,432. For a year of brutal work farming 480 acres with modern equipment, Carl walked away with about $10,000. It was a wake-up call, but he told himself it was temporary. Prices would recover. They always did. Dale's 320 acres yielded 116 bushels per acre at $2.30 per bushel. Gross, $85,280. Costs, $39,000. Net, $46,280. Dale made more than 4 times what Carl made, farming a third less land because he had no debt. But Carl didn't know this. Farmers don't share financial details, especially when those details are embarrassing. So Carl assumed everyone was struggling equally, and Dale assumed Carl was doing fine with all that modern equipment. Then 1976 brought weather problems. A late, cold spring delayed planting across Nebraska. Summer was excessively wet, and fungal diseases hit corn hard. Carl's yields dropped to 98 bushels per acre. Prices stayed depressed at $2.25. His gross revenue on 480 acres, $105,840. Operating costs hadn't decreased. He still had the same inputs, same fuel consumption, same fixed costs. Net before payments, $21,840. After payments of $38,000, negative $16,160. Carl lost money. For the first time in his farming career, he'd worked all year and gone backwards financially. He went to his banker in November, a man named Richard Stoltz who'd approved all of Carl's loans. "I need some help," Carl said. "I had a bad year. I need to refinance some operating debt and push out my payment schedule." Richard, who'd been hearing similar requests from a lot of farmers, looked at Carl's loan portfolio and frowned. "Carl, you're leveraged pretty heavily. Your debt-to-equity ratio is concerning. If we refinance, we'll have to increase your interest rate to reflect the risk." "By how much?" 10.5% on the operating debt. Carl felt sick. That would push his annual payments even higher. But he didn't have a choice. He couldn't make the current payments. He refinanced $12,000 of operating debt at the higher rate, which added another $1,400 to his annual obligations. He was now paying nearly $40,000 per year in debt service. Dale's 320 acres in 1976 yielded 93 bushels per acre. The weather affected everyone equally. At $2.25 per bushel, gross was $67,368. Costs, $37,000. Net, $30,368. Not a great year by any measure, but Dale slept fine. He had no debt. His bills were paid. He had money in the bank. The bad year was uncomfortable, but not catastrophic. By 1977, Carl was starting to feel genuine fear. Corn prices had stabilized around $2.15 per bushel, but they weren't recovering to the levels he'd based his expansion on. His yields were back to normal, 118 bushels per acre, but gross revenue of $121,632 minus operating costs of $86,000 left only $35,632. After debt payments, negative $4,368. Another losing year. Carl was burning through savings he didn't really have. He started deferring maintenance on equipment. He cut back on fertilizer, which would hurt future yields. He stopped taking a salary for himself, living on savings and credit cards. His wife got a job in town as a secretary to bring him money. The stress was crushing. And then in 1978, 2 things happened that sealed Carl's fate. First, interest rates started rising sharply as the Federal Reserve tried to combat inflation. Carl's land loan had a variable rate provision, something he hadn't paid much attention to when he signed the papers in 1975. The rate adjusted from 9% to 11.5%. His annual land payment jumped from $25,920 to nearly $32,000. Second, his 4,430 needed major repairs. The transmission started slipping, a problem that the dealer diagnosed as wear on the clutch packs in the power shift assembly. The repair cost, $6,800. Carl didn't have $6,800. He'd already maxed out his operating line of credit. He went back to Richard Stoltz at the bank and asked for another short-term loan. Richard said no. Carl, I can't lend you more money. You're already underwater. Your debt load exceeds the value of your operation at current market conditions. Carl felt the world tilt. What are you saying? Richard sighed. I'm saying you need to make some serious decisions. Sell some land to pay down debt. Sell equipment. Something. Because at your current trajectory, you're going to default. Carl left the bank in a daze. That evening, he stood at the fence line where he'd stood so many times before, and Dale pulled up in his old pickup. Dale could see something was wrong. You okay, Carl? Carl laughed, a hollow sound. Remember when I told you to buy a 4,430 like I did? Dale nodded. Carl stared out at the fields he'd mortgaged everything to own. Don't. I'm going broke. Dale, I owe so much money I can't see daylight. And I don't know how to fix it. Dale didn't know what to say. He felt a mixture of sympathy and vindication that shamed him. Can you sell something? Carl shook his head. The 4430's transmission is blown. Even if I could sell it, I'd take a huge loss. It's worth maybe $30,000 in this condition, and I still owe $37,000 on the loan. The land is worth less than I paid for it. If I sold, I'd still owe the bank money after sale. They stood in silence. Finally, Dale said, I'm sorry, Carl. I wish I could help. Carl turned to look at him. You tried to help. You just didn't buy what I was selling. Turned out you were smarter than me. Carl limped through 1978 and 1979. He got the 4,430 fixed by taking out a personal loan from a finance company at 18% interest. He cut costs everywhere he could. But commodity prices stayed depressed. His debt kept compounding and interest rates kept rising. By 1980, the prime rate had hit 15%, and Carl's variable rate loans were being adjusted upward every year. His annual debt service had climbed to over $50,000. He was farming 480 acres and losing $10,000 to $15,000 per year, even in decent growing seasons. In the spring of 1979, he stopped at Dale's place one last time. Dale was in his machine shed, rebuilding the carburetor on the 720. Carl watched him work for a minute, then said, That tractor's got to be 25 years old. Dale nodded. 21, actually. Bought it used in 63. Does it ever break down? All the time, but I can fix it myself. Cost me parts and time, but no dealer bills. Carl was quiet for a moment. I wish I'd listened to you back in 74. Dale set down his wrench. Carl, you didn't know. None of us knew prices would fall like this. Carl shook his head. My dad knew. He told me never to borrow money I couldn't pay back in 2 years. I didn't listen. I thought I was smarter than the old generation. Turns out they knew exactly what they were talking about. In June of 1979, Carl Hoffman received a letter from the bank. He was 90 days delinquent on his land payment, 60 days on his equipment notes. They were demanding immediate payment to bring the loans current, or they would begin foreclosure proceedings. Carl didn't have the money. He couldn't bring the loans current. He hired a lawyer and tried to negotiate, but the bank was under pressure from federal regulators to clean up bad agricultural loans, and they weren't willing to work with him anymore. In October of 1979, the bank started foreclosure. By April 1980, the 480 acres Carl had assembled, the 4430 he'd been so proud of, the planter and the plow and everything else, it all went to auction. Dale Kruger attended that auction, not to bid, but to bear witness. He watched his neighbor's life being liquidated in front of a crowd of bargain hunters, and other farmers grateful it wasn't them standing there. The 4430, with 3,200 hours and a rebuilt transmission, sold for $26,000. Someone got a hell of a deal. The planter went for $4,000. The 160 acres Carl had bought in 1975 for $2,000 per acre sold for $1,300 per acre. The market had turned, and land values were dropping. After the auction, after the bank applied the proceeds to Carl's debts, he still owed them $48,000 on an unsecured deficiency judgment. He declared bankruptcy 3 months later. Carl moved to Omaha, and got a job as a parts manager at a truck dealership. He never farmed again. His wife divorced him in 1982. The stress, the shame, the financial destruction, it had killed the marriage just as surely as it had killed the farm. Dale heard through mutual acquaintances that Carl blamed himself entirely, that he'd told people the bank didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself by believing the hype about modern equipment and expansion and leverage. "I thought debt was a tool," Carl had reportedly said. "Turns out it's a noose." Now, let me pause here and explain what was happening on a larger scale, because Carl Hoffman's story wasn't unique. It was happening to tens of thousands of farmers across the Great Plains and the Midwest between 1978 and 1985. According to USDA data, over 235,000 farms failed during this period. Farm debt, which had totaled about $50 billion in 1970, had exploded to over $200 billion by 1980. Land values, which had seemed like they'd rise forever, peaked in 1981 and then collapsed by as much as 60% in some regions by 1987. Interest rates, which had been manageable at 8 to 9% in the early 70s, spiked above 20% by 1981. And commodity prices, which farmers had convinced themselves would stay elevated, fell to levels that hadn't been seen since the 1930s. Corn dropped below $2 per bushel. Soybeans fell to $5. Farmers who'd borrowed heavily to expand during the boom years found themselves in an impossible situation. They owed more than their land and equipment were worth. They couldn't generate enough revenue to service their debt, and banks were foreclosing at rates not seen since the Great Depression. The emotional and social toll was staggering. Farm auctions became community tragedies, with neighbors standing around watching families lose everything their grandparents had built. Suicide rates among farmers spiked. Rural mental health organizations were overwhelmed, and the economic structure of rural America fundamentally changed. The farms that survived were either the very large operations with enough scale to absorb losses, or the small to medium operations with little to no debt. The middle, farms like Carl's, moderately sized operations that had borrowed to expand, were wiped out. Dale Kruger survived because he had no debt. In the worst years of the crisis, when corn fell to $1.70 per bushel and Dale's 320 acres only netted him $15,000 for the year, he still survived. He couldn't have made a $40,000 annual debt payment on $15,000 in net income. Nobody could, but he didn't have to. His equipment was old but paid for. His land was inherited and clear. When prices were terrible, he just tightened his belt, cut costs, and waited for conditions to improve. By 1987, when the crisis was finally over and land prices started recovering, Dale was still there, still farming. And here's something that needs to be said clearly. Dale wasn't smarter than Carl. He wasn't a better farmer. He didn't work harder. His land wasn't better. His luck wasn't better. The only difference between them was that Dale had refused to take on debt for equipment and expansion. That's it. That one decision, repeated year after year, to resist the pressure from dealers and neighbors and the general culture of agricultural borrowing. That's what saved him. I want to share something Dale told me when I interviewed him for this story. He's 92 years old now, long retired, but he still lives on the original farmstead. His grandson farms the land now, fourth generation, with modern equipment that's all paid for. Dale said, "When Carl lost his farm, I felt terrible. I wondered if I should have tried harder to talk him out of buying all that equipment. But then I realized nobody would have listened to me. Hell, Carl thought I was a fool for not modernizing. The culture at that time was so strong. Everyone telling you to borrow, to expand, to get bigger. It was almost impossible to resist. The only reason I resisted was because I'd seen my father almost lose everything in the 50s. And that fear was stronger than my desire to impress my neighbors. But most farmers didn't have that fear. They believed what the dealers and the banks were telling them, and it destroyed them. Let me bring this into modern context, because the patterns haven't changed. Only the numbers have gotten bigger. Today, a new high-horsepower tractor can cost $450,000. A new combine can cost $650,000. A modern farming operation can require $2 million in equipment, and the dealers have financing programs that make it seem manageable. Look at the monthly payment. They say it's only $3,500 a month over 10 years. But they don't talk about what happens if commodity prices drop. They don't talk about the total interest you'll pay, often $200,000 or more on a $500,000 tractor loan. They don't talk about the psychological burden of knowing that one drought, one price collapse, one serious equipment failure could unravel everything, and the pressure can form to keep up with neighbors to have the newest equipment. That pressure is more intense now than it was in the 1970s. Social media has made it worse. Young farmers see pictures of brand new tractors and state-of-the-art combines and immaculate shop buildings, and they feel like failures if they're running 20-year-old equipment. But what they're not seeing is the debt load behind those shiny machines. They're not seeing the sleepless nights, the maxed-out credit lines, the constant stress of trying to generate enough revenue to service loans that never go away. Here's what I want you to understand. Carl Hoffman wasn't a cautionary tale about farming badly. He was a cautionary tale about farming the way the agricultural industry tells you to farm. He did everything right according to the conventional wisdom of his era. He borrowed to expand. He upgraded to modern equipment. He followed agronomists' recommendations for inputs. He farmed efficiently, and it destroyed him. Meanwhile, Dale Kruger did everything wrong according to that same conventional wisdom. He refused to borrow. He ran old equipment. He farmed small. He ignored the pressure to modernize. And he survived. The lesson isn't that you should never upgrade equipment or that all debt is bad. The lesson is that debt eliminates flexibility. And in agriculture, where you can't control prices or weather, flexibility is survival. If you can absorb 2 or 3 bad years without going bankrupt, you'll probably be fine long-term. If you can't, you're gambling that you'll never have 2 or 3 bad years in a row. And in farming, that's a bet you'll eventually lose. I spent 3 weeks researching this story. I interviewed Dale Kruger directly, spent hours talking to him about the 70s and 80s farm crisis. I reviewed court records from Carl Hoffman's bankruptcy filing. I studied Federal Reserve data on agricultural lending and default rates during this period. I talked to retired bankers who worked in agricultural lending during the crisis, and the pattern is undeniable and consistent. The farms that failed were disproportionately the ones that had borrowed heavily to expand and modernize in the mid-70s. The farms that survived had low debt. That's the whole story. It's not complicated. It's not mysterious. High debt plus bad conditions equals failure. Low debt plus bad conditions equals survival. If you're farming now, or thinking about getting into farming, or advising someone who is, please learn from Carl Hoffman's mistake. Don't let a neighbor's new tractor convince you that you need one too. Don't let a dealer's financing pitch convince you that debt is normal or manageable. Don't let the culture of modern agriculture convince you that you're falling behind if you're not constantly upgrading. The farmers who sleep well at night are the ones who don't owe money. The farmers who lose sleep are the ones servicing debt and praying for good weather and high prices. Which one do you want to be? If this story resonates with you, if you've seen this pattern in your own family or community, tell us about it in the comments. If you knew farmers who lost everything in the 80s crisis, or if you survived it yourself, share your experience. These stories matter. This history matters. And the lessons are more relevant today than ever, because we're seeing the same patterns repeat, just with bigger numbers and more sophisticated financing schemes. Hit that subscribe button if you think this message is important. This channel exists to preserve agricultural history and document the hard lessons previous generations learned. Every video takes weeks of research because I believe these stories can save farms and families. If you agree, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Especially young farmers being pressured by dealers and lenders to take on massive debt. Show them what happened to Carl Hoffman. Show them what Dale Kruger did differently. And maybe, just maybe, they'll resist the pressure and build something sustainable instead of something that looks impressive but collapses at the first sign of trouble. Dale Kruger still has that 1958 John Deere 720. By the way, it sits in his grandson's machine shed, fully restored, still functional. It's 66 years old now. It outlasted the 4430 that Carl bought, which was probably scrapped years ago after being run into the ground by whoever bought it at auction. The 720 is slower, less powerful, less comfortable, but it doesn't owe anyone a penny. And it's still there, still part of a farm that's been in the same family for over 130 years, because a man who owned it understood something that Carl Hoffman learned too late. The newest equipment won't save your farm, but staying out of debt might. What would you have done in 1974 if you were Dale? Would you have had the strength to resist when your neighbor was showing off his new tractor and telling you that you were being left behind? Or would you have done what Carl did, what most farmers did, and borrow to keep up? Be honest in the comments. And remember, it's easy to say you'd have done the right thing when you know how the story ends. But in the moment, when everyone around you is borrowing and expanding and you're the only one saying no, that takes a kind of courage most people don't have. Dale had it, Carl didn't, and that made all the difference. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.